Have you ever wondered why, even knowing what you want, you often feel an almost uncontrollable urge to act differently? Why do certain decisions seem tainted by an invisible concern? What will others think? You adjust your behavior, choose your words carefully, suppress opinions, not because it reflects who you are, but because you fear the discomfort of disapproval. If you are honest, you will realize, to a greater or lesser extent, you seek approval. We all do. And that is exactly where the trap lies. Society was not designed for you to be authentic. It was designed for you to adapt. Since childhood, you have learned that acceptance is a valuable currency, that pleasing generates reward, that obedience guarantees belonging. Unbeknownst to you, you were conditioned to confuse personal worth with external validation, and thus, the quest for approval becomes deeply rooted in your psyche. But here is the hidden cost. The more you seek to be accepted, the further you drift away from yourself. Your choices cease to be genuine and become shaped by the fear of rejection. Your behaviors turn into a theater. Your freedom becomes a performance staged for invisible audiences. Deep down, you become a hostage to others' opinions, and your life ceases to be yours. Carl Jung understood this dark dynamic like few others. He stated, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are." But how is that possible if you live trapped in a character you have built to survive in the world? This is the great tragedy of the quest for approval. It creates a persona, a mask, that over time begins to seem like your true identity. And the more you feed this persona, the further you get from the self, from your authentic center. Worse still, the aspects you suppress to maintain this idealized image, your anger, your desires, your fears, end up cast into the shadow. And as the shadow grows, your authenticity disappears. Here is a brutal paradox. The more you try to please, the less you please yourself. The more you seek to be accepted, the more you reject yourself. In the effort to mold yourself to what the world expects, you distance yourself from what could be your greatest strength, the courage to be who you truly are. In this video, you will discover how everything changes when you decide to stop seeking approval. We will explore Jung's ideas on psychological types and why certain profiles are more vulnerable to this trap. We will unravel the role of the persona, understand the transformative power of the shadow, and comprehend the process of individuation, the journey to becoming whole. But a warning, this journey requires courage. It is more comfortable to keep pleasing. It is easier to maintain the role that others project onto you. But the question you need to answer is simple. Do you want to be accepted, or do you want to be free? The two rarely go hand in hand. If you have the courage to face this invisible prison, this video could be a turning point in your life. The choice is yours. Are you ready to begin? Have you ever wondered why some people seem to desperately depend on the approval of others, while others can follow their own path even in the face of criticism and rejection? It's not just about willpower or life experiences. There is a much deeper root, which Carl Jung unveiled in his monumental work, Psychological Types. According to Jung, each of us has a predominant psychological type that shapes the way we perceive the world and interact with it. This orientation can be inward, introversion, or outward, extroversion. But that's just the beginning. Jung went further and described 4 basic psychological functions: thinking, feeling, sensing, and intuition. And here lies a powerful insight. Depending on how these functions manifest in you, your vulnerability to the search for approval can be drastically different. People whose psychological functioning is dominated by extroverted feeling, for example, are much more exposed to this trap. Why? Because their internal compass is oriented by the social environment. They evaluate their worth, their actions, and even their ideas based on what is accepted, valued, or desired by others. The problem? The world out there is volatile, inconsistent, and often cruel. Placing your identity in the hands of this game is a sure recipe for suffering. Now, imagine a person with a predominant introverted thinking. They can be equally vulnerable, but in a different way. In this case, the fear of disapproval does not arise from a need to please, but from the fear of exposing ideas or beliefs that may be rejected. The result is the same: self-censorship, repression, and a life lived in half-light, always falling short of true potential. What Jung teaches us is that no matter your psychological type, the search for approval can find subtle ways to infiltrate your psyche. And the more you ignore this influence, the more it controls you. Typology is not a destiny, but a map. And only when you understand your basic configuration can you begin to neutralize the automatic impulses that lead you to bow to social approval. The greater danger lies in how this orientation crystallizes over a lifetime. The more you reinforce a behavior aimed at pleasing, the more you train your brain to depend on that external validation. Over time, this shapes not only your attitudes, but your own self-image. You begin to believe that you are only worthy if you are accepted, that you only have value if others approve. This is how you become a prisoner. But here's the brutal truth. No one can please everyone. And the more you try, the further you distance yourself from yourself. Each concession made out of fear of disapproval is a small murder of your authenticity. And the sum of these small murders generates an empty life, disconnected from the true self. Therefore, the first step to freeing yourself is to recognize how your psychological type feeds this pattern. Not to blame yourself, but to become aware. To start saying no when your automatic tendency would be to please. To dare to take a stand even when criticism is inevitable. And most importantly, to remember that your inner peace is worth infinitely more than the fickle approval of others. But understanding your type and your conditioning is just the beginning. There is an even more powerful force operating behind the scenes of your psyche. A force that transforms the search for approval into a true theater of masks. And that is what we will talk about in the next part, the persona. The social mask you wear every day, and that you may have already forgotten, is just a mask. Don't miss it. If this content is making sense to you, click the subscribe button and subscribe to the channel. Thank you for your support. You are not who you think you are, and I will prove it to you. We all wear masks. This is inevitable. From a young age, we learn to behave in certain ways to be accepted, praised, recognized. You smile when you don't feel like it. You say everything is fine when it's not. You adapt to environments where you feel uncomfortable, just to avoid standing out. Each of these small adaptations creates your persona. Carl Jung described the persona in 2 essays on analytical psychology as a segment of the psyche that forms to mediate the relationship between the individual and society. It is essentially a social mask. And here's the detail that few understand. The persona is not a problem in itself. It is necessary. Without it, we would be unable to function in society. We need roles, professional, familial, social, to survive in the external world. But there is a danger, a subtle and deadly danger. When you identify too much with your persona, you lose yourself. What should be just a facade, a functional role, becomes your identity. You forget who you really are because you are completely immersed in the mask you built to please. And it is precisely here that the quest for approval becomes a deep trap. The persona is shaped by external expectations. The more you seek to please, the more you reinforce an idealized persona. And the more this persona is reinforced, the further you drift from your true self. You no longer live for yourself. You live to maintain the character. Observe your life with brutal honesty. How many decisions have you made just to meet others' expectations? How many relationships have you maintained to avoid disappointing? How many times have you silenced your true opinion to preserve an image? Each of these choices reinforced your persona and suffocated your authentic self a little more. And here comes a hard truth to swallow. As long as you are investing energy to maintain this persona, you will never be free. Because freedom requires truth, and truth requires the courage to disappoint. Disappoint others, yes, but mainly to disappoint the image you created to be accepted. Jung warns us that the process of individuation, the journey of becoming who you really are, only begins when you realize that the persona is not you. As long as you believe you are this social mask, you will be condemned to a life of constant vigilance, fear of rejection, and an inner peace that never arrives. But the path to this liberation is not simple. It requires a deep confrontation with the unconscious forces that sustain the persona. And one of these forces is immensely powerful. The fear of what you hide from yourself. The fear of your shadow. It is what keeps the persona standing. And it is what we need to confront if we truly want to break free from the dependence on external approval. In the next part, we will dive into this dark and fascinating territory. You will understand how the integration of the shadow is the essential step to dissolve the fear of rejection and reclaim authenticity. Get ready. The confrontation will not be comfortable, but without it, freedom is impossible. The question you need to ask yourself now is brutally simple. Have you been living as who you are or as who you think you should be? If you have had the courage to follow this video up to this point, you have already begun to understand that the persona you present to the world is not your true self. But recognizing the mask is just the first step. The real challenge lies in dismantling it. And this requires a deep process, a dive into the journey that Jung called individuation. In The Archetypes and the Collective Unconscious, and in Modern Man in Search of a Soul, Jung describes individuation as the path to becoming what you truly are, not what society, your family, or your traumas say you should be. But don't be mistaken. This is one of the most challenging processes a human being can undertake, because it requires you to break consciously and deliberately with your false self. The false self is the product of years, perhaps decades, of conditioning. It has been shaped by explicit and implicit rules. Boys don't cry. Girls should be nice. Success means status. Failure is shame. You will only be loved if you are perfect. Each of these messages has embedded itself in your psyche, forming an artificial self that you came to believe was real. And why did you do this? Because that is how one survives in a world that values conformity. It is easier to be accepted when you adapt to expectations. The problem is that with each adaptation, you drift a little further from your essence. The price of social approval is the alienation of the self. Individuation is the process of undoing this silent pact with mediocrity. It is the path back to authenticity, but this path is not paved with flowers. On the contrary, it inevitably goes through pain, deconstruction, and loneliness. Because in breaking with the false self, you inevitably disappoint. You disappoint your family, your friends, your culture, and perhaps even more difficult, you disappoint the idealized image you have built of yourself. But here is the truth that no one tells. This pain is necessary. It is a labor pain. The old self must die for the true self to be born. Without this break, you will remain a prisoner, even if you call it a full life. Jung teaches us that individuation is not a state that is reached and done. It is a continuous process, a cycle of constant deconstruction and reconstruction. a call to integrate everything that has been rejected, suppressed, or distorted in the name of acceptance. But how to take that step? How to confront the parts of yourself that you have spent your whole life hiding? This is where one of the deepest and most challenging concepts of Jungian psychology comes in: the integration of the shadow. The shadow is the reservoir of everything you have repressed out of fear of disapproval. Your impulses, your desires, your unacceptable emotions. And as long as you do not face this shadow, you will remain its hostage. The search for approval, at its core, is the fear that the shadow will come to the surface. In the next part, we will explore in depth how it forms and why integrating it is the most crucial step to freeing yourself from dependence on external approval. If what you're hearing resonates with you, you'll find real value in my ebooks. Beyond the Shadow breaks down Jung's core ideas, while Dialogues with the Unconscious gives you a 30-day path to apply them in your life. Both are linked in the pinned comment. Now we arrive at the heart of the matter. Everything we have explored so far, social conditioning, psychological typology, the persona, points to a single dark core that silently governs your quest for approval: the shadow. Carl Jung dedicated much of his work to this concept. And in Ion, he shows us that the shadow is composed of everything you reject in yourself. Not just your weaknesses and flaws, but also your unlived potentials, your repressed anger, your unacknowledged power, your desire for freedom. Everything that, at some point, you considered unacceptable, inappropriate, or too dangerous to show the world. But what does this have to do with the fear of disapproval? Absolutely everything. The quest for approval largely arises from the fear that others will see what you hide, what you yourself cannot accept. As long as you keep parts of yourself locked in the basement of the psyche, you will always be vulnerable to others' judgment. Every criticism will touch an open wound. Every disapproval will be a risk of exposure. And so, you will remain trapped in the infinite game of trying to please in order not to be revealed. Integrating the shadow is the radical act of turning inward and saying, "I see you, I acknowledge you, and I accept you." It is a painful process because confronting the shadow means facing everything you fear most about being. The envious, the aggressive, the petty, the fragile, the needy. All these aspects are part of you. Denying them does not make them disappear. On the contrary, the more you repress the shadow, the more it controls your life from behind the scenes. Integration happens when you allow these contents to emerge into consciousness in a controlled and reflective manner. When you recognize that yes, you are capable of dark feelings, but that does not define you. When you embrace the totality of your being, you become less dependent on external validation, because there are no more secrets to protect. There is no longer a need to maintain an impeccable persona. Make no mistake, integrating the shadow does not mean acting impulsively based on your repressed impulses. It means integrating them consciously so that they become allies rather than internal enemies. An individual who has integrated their shadow is whole. And those who are whole do not fear rejection, because they have fully accepted themselves. This is the true end of the fear of disapproval. It is not a game of becoming strong or indifferent. It is a deep state of self-acceptance that dissolves the need for approval. When you no longer fear yourself, the gaze of others loses the power to hurt you. But theory, no matter how powerful, gains even greater strength when embodied in real life. And no one exemplified this process of breaking away from approval and integrating authenticity like Jung himself. His journey away from Freud and the psychoanalytic establishment is a living example of how brutal courage is needed to follow the inner calling, even at the cost of isolation and criticism. In the next part, we will dive into this inspiring story, Jung's break with Freud. and understand how he faced his own shadow and was reborn as the creator of analytical psychology. If you want to see how theory becomes life, don't miss it. The story of the break between Jung and Sigmund Freud is much more than a theoretical divergence. It was a true rite of passage, an act of courage that put Jung on a collision course with everything he had achieved up to that point: recognition, prestige, professional security, a leadership position in the psychoanalytic movement. Breaking with Freud was not just an intellectual decision. It was a profound movement of individuation, a confrontation with his own shadow, and with the most primal fear of all, the fear of being rejected by those we admire the most. In Memories, Dreams, Reflections, Jung describes this process with brutal honesty. For years, he was seen as the natural heir to psychoanalysis. Freud was not only his mentor, he was an almost paternal figure, a tremendous reference in the intellectual landscape of the time. Being alongside Freud meant being at the epicenter of a revolution in the understanding of the human psyche. But gradually, Jung began to realize that something in his own vision of the psyche could no longer be contained by the frameworks of Freudian theory. Freud insisted on an almost exclusive explanation of sexuality as the driving force of the psyche. For Jung, this was an unacceptable reduction. He had delved into deep experiences, dreams, visions, archetypal symbols that pointed to a psyche much broader, more complex, and spiritual than Freud could accept. And then came the decisive moment. Jung knew that by following his own path, he would face isolation. He knew he would be accused of intellectual heresy. He knew that the approval of the psychoanalytic circle would be replaced by criticism, disdain, and worst of all, personal betrayal. And yet, he chose to proceed, not without pain, not without fear, but with unwavering integrity. During the period known as his confrontation with the unconscious, Jung entered a deep crisis. Isolated, questioned, without the support of the scientific community that had once applauded him, he immersed himself in the study of archetypes, alchemy, mythology, everything that led him to develop analytical psychology. But see, this crossing was only possible because Jung faced his shadow. He had to confront his own fear of rejection, his wounded pride, his need for approval. And by doing so, he emerged on the other side as a profoundly free man, a man who no longer depended on the acceptance of others to validate his vision. This story is not just about Jung, it is about you, because at some point in your life, you too will be called to break with something or someone. Perhaps with a social group, a family pattern, a job, a relationship, or even with an image you have created of yourself. And at that moment, the choice will be the same: to please and remain trapped, or to break free and become who you really are. But how do you prepare for this? How do you strengthen your mind and spirit to bear the weight of disapproval? How do you sustain your authenticity, even when the world tries to pull you back into conformity? This is what we will talk about in the next and final part. We will explore how you can, in practice, begin to free yourself from the search for approval and build a life of radical authenticity. If you have made it this far, it is because you are ready to take this step, and the final part of this video will show you how. We have reached the final point of this journey, and now I need to ask a question you can no longer avoid. Are you ready to be who you are? Perhaps, up to this point, you have realized for the first time how much the search for approval has shaped your life. Maybe you have felt a growing discomfort, a knot in your stomach, upon recognizing that much of your choices have been dictated by the desire to be accepted. This is not weakness, this is human. We have all been conditioned to seek approval. The problem is that few have the courage to break free from this invisible prison. Breaking free does not mean becoming an empty rebel, opposing everything and everyone just for the sake of opposition. It means indeed making a conscious choice to live your truth, even when it costs you disapproving looks, criticism, or even the loss of connections that no longer serve your growth. Authenticity has a price, but inauthenticity has a much higher price: the slow death of your spirit. Carl Jung shows us that we only become whole when we stop trying to be what others expect and start being who we are, with all our complexity, our lights and shadows. When we integrate our shadow, when we undo the identification with the persona, when we understand our psychological type and its conditioning, we take a real step toward the self, that deep core of the psyche that longs to be lived. But beware, do not expect a fairy tale ending. Individuation is not a comfortable destination. It is a continuous journey that requires constant vigilance. Even after significant advances, the old impulse to seek approval returns, sneaky, disguised in new masks. Therefore, the practice of authenticity must be daily, relentless. Each choice is a battleground between the self and the persona. Each day offers the chance to deepen your freedom or to return to the gilded cage of approval. Now, I want you to reflect with brutal honesty and share in the comments. What has been the main area of your life where you realized you seek approval? Relationships, work, family, social media, name it. Exposing it is already an act of liberation. When you bring the unconscious to consciousness, you begin to weaken its power over you. And if this video has provoked you, made you think, challenged you, great. That was exactly what needed to happen. And the good news is, there are many more layers to explore on this journey. So, keep watching the next video. It is essential to deepen this transformation even further. Do not ignore this. Every step you take brings you closer to a life lived in truth. See you there.